Welcome to the Tanya Acker Show. My next guest is Max Miller. He is the creator and the host of Tasting History with Max Miller. You can see the show on YouTube. It's really cool. It's all about history and food and what people were eating at different moments in history. I love history. I love food. So I think you'll really like his show. I also think you're really going to like the story of how his show came to be, because our friend Max Miller took a dose of pandemic misfortune and mixed it with his own creativity and came up with his particular recipe for success. I thought that he would be inspirational to some other folks. I found some inspiration in Max Miller, and I think you're going to enjoy him. And I also think you're going to enjoy his show if you haven't seen it yet. Tasting History with Max Miller, and here I am with Max. Max Miller, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have to tell you, you are the confluence of so many things that I love. Making lemons out of lemonade, Disneyland, food, and history. Let's take it from the top, because once upon a time, you had a great job working for Disney. Tell us about your job and why you loved it so much.
Yeah, so I got to work all over the company, which was wonderful. I worked at Disney Cruise Line and Disney Character Voices, but my last position was working for the movie studio, and I had been there for 7 years, I think, working on some of the biggest movies of all time, you know, the Star Wars and Avengers and everything. And I worked in the marketing department. And so, you know, it was an artistic atmosphere. It was full of camaraderie. Everyone was so excited to be there because the size of these films and how popular they were. It was just a really exciting time to work there. And I kind of bounced around. I worked in media. I worked in the creative marketing side, on the music team, working on trailers.
You were Prince Charming? You were Prince Charming?
I was Prince Charming. Yes, when I worked on Disney Cruise Line, I was Prince Charming and Peter Pan, which was that was one of the best years of my entire life. I had this wonderful job at Disney, and then I got furloughed, obviously, for COVID.
Before the furlough, you then go to Disney World. I haven't been to Disney World. I've been only to Disneyland.
Oh,
but yeah, I'm sure it is, because it's only a bigger version of the happiest place on earth. You develop a passion for baking because of the Great British Bake Off. So you then take that passion and start making cakes and videos for your friends, and they're into it. So you're still working at Disney and you're making these videos. Why? Because you just love to bake and you love the show, and then you realize that people like to eat what you made?
Well, it was interesting because so we went to Walt Disney World. I went with my friend Mo, and she got sick on day one, and we spent the entire vacation pretty much in the hotel room. We had been to Disney World before, so it was, you know, it wasn't too bad, but we basically spent the whole time in the hotel room. And she introduced me to the Great British Bake Off. I had never cooked a thing in my life. I didn't even know how to like boil water for pasta. I was a mess. But I fell in love with this show because, one, I'm an Anglophile, so anything English and charming, and I'm in all the way. But two, it was so different from every other reality show that I had watched here in the U.S. because cooking shows here in the U.S. tend to be like, okay, make us a dessert, but you have to use this like 3-day-old garbage squid ink and Special K, you know? Whereas this was like, no, not only are we going to bake stuff that's just wonderful, but in those early seasons, they taught the viewer how to bake. They went through the process a lot more. And so you could learn simply by watching the show. And that's what I ended up doing. I came home and was like, I'm going to try to make some of those things that they made. And so I just, over the next few years, kind of taught myself how to bake. Also in those early episodes, they would talk about the history of what they were baking. And I think that that's the other thing that grabbed me, because while I didn't cook, I've always loved history. And so just kind of marrying those two topics was really interesting to me. And so I would bring in my bakes to work and have my coworkers try them out. But if they wanted to eat it, they also had to listen to a little lecture on the history of whatever dish I brought in. And Christmas of 2019, we had a temp who was there often, and we were at a Christmas party, and she said, "You should put this online. You should put this on YouTube. They're interesting stories that you tell, and the baking is wonderful." And just immediately I thought, well, I want to bring back those Great British Bake Off history segments that had gone away. They don't do them anymore. And so I started Tasting History on YouTube.
You must be really good, because not only do your colleagues want to eat your food, they're willing to listen to your history lessons about where the food came from. But when we'll talk later about your great show, Tasting History, and it's easy to see why they listen to you, because you're so fun. You've now got this YouTube channel. You've got a job you love at Disney. You've got colleagues who you love at Disney who are encouraging this outside passion. But then you have to deal with the same thing that the rest of humanity dealt with a couple of years ago, which was COVID. And you were furloughed from Disney. So during the furlough, you do what?
It happened right after I started the channel. I started the channel, my first episode was the last week of February, and we got sent home the second week of March. So it was very soon after I had started the show. We tried to work from home for a couple weeks, but the movie theaters were all shutting down. And at this point, I was working with the movie theaters, so there wasn't anything for me to do. So we went on furlough. And my then fiance, now husband, was working from home. He also works at Walt Disney Studios. Well, he was very, very busy because he was working on Disney Plus. And that was, it had just released. So I had to stay out of his hair. And we have a very small condo. So I had to just go up to my room and sit all day while he was on meetings. And so it gave me so much time to really focus on the channel, and more so focus on the skills that I needed to develop to make better videos. There's so many aspects to making good YouTube videos that you don't think about. And those first few months, I just had nothing but free time to focus on that. It was great.
Then Disney calls you back and they say, "Yay, everybody's going back to work." At some point, you decide you are going to follow your passion, Max. You turn your back on the great job with the very stable employer who everybody knows. They've been there for a long time. Disney's going to be around for a long time, but you take a leap and bet on yourself. How do you have the courage to do that?
The channel had taken off, and so it was making an income. And two, I have Jose, who still works for the company, so we would still have insurance and everything, and he makes a good living there. So even if everything fell apart, it's not like we would starve.
But it was a sacrifice. I mean, you have to take a leap. It's a sacrifice.
Yes. And it's funny, you mentioned this stable employer. And one thing that I had learned, that a lot of people learned, is stable employment is not stable. It sounds harsh, but they abandoned me for an entire year. I was furloughed and not being paid for an entire year. So this employer who I loved, and I loved the work, they did not stand by us when things got tough. And so any feeling of loyalty, that was gone. So then it just became a feeling of, I love this job, but I also love tasting history. And I knew that I couldn't do both because I had now invested so much into tasting history, and the videos were becoming longer, and it's a full-time job. So I had to make a decision, and kind of looking out 5 years from now, tasting history could become something extraordinary, whereas my job with Disney, I had a very set path. And I decided to opt for extraordinary, even if it's not a sure thing.
Let's just talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts, because lots of people have access to YouTube. Lots of people like to make interesting videos and put themselves up, and friends and family and others like and share and all of that. How do you turn that into a business, Max? Like, how do you say, you know what? I love this passion. People are watching these videos. My partner and I are going to just kind of dig in deep, and I'm going to go out on a limb, because that's not a responsible choice for everybody. But
It wasn't a responsible choice for me.
But you clearly had some things in play. You had some things in place that made it make sense for you. Can you just sort of explain how you navigated that transition?
I think there are two parts. One is simply having the background to be able to make the kind of content that people do want to watch. And I have failed at a lot of things in my life. And at the time of those failures, I felt like a failure. And now looking back, they have all been learning experiences where I learned the skills to do what I'm doing now. I was an actor for a long time, and I don't want to say I failed as an actor, but I ended up quitting because I wasn't paying enough of my bills, as an actor, and I did voice acting. I worked in music, and that didn't work out. I've worked in writing, storytelling, and that didn't work out. But in each of those endeavors, I learned the skills to be able to do what I'm doing, which is storytelling, acting. I'm myself, but it is acting. It is performing in front of a camera. And the cadence of videos, it's like music. It's the ups and downs and everything. So all of those skills, I think it takes a lot of time to learn those skills. And so sometimes when someone just jumps into YouTube and they don't have those skills, it's going to take a while to develop that. And everybody can, I think, but I had already done that before starting the show. So that was fortunate, because a lot of people have to make 100 or 200 videos before they catch on, before people decide to start watching them. The channel really grew within 4 months for me. So, I had made about 20 videos. So that's fortunate for me. And because of that fairly rapid growth, I think that's one of the reasons I had the confidence to make the decision to follow Tasting History. I've always been a big saver, so we had a little savings. So if things went wrong, we've got that.
I was waiting for it. You didn't do this on credit cards. You didn't do this just on credit cards.
So it's kind of funny, because there's another YouTuber that I would watch named Graham Stephan, who's a finance YouTuber, and he also made a series of videos on how to make YouTube videos. And watching those videos ended up really helping me to start the channel. But also watching his finance videos, because I would get so motivated to save. And this is really in the 2 years before starting Tasting History. So I was saving, as I was kind of a cheapskate. I'm not gonna lie. I would save more than I probably should have. And I'm so grateful that I did.
But Max is like, I get to be cheap, because even though I will not buy a round of drinks, I will bring y'all some cake, and you will eat my cake and love my cake. So just because, so you contributed, you carried your weight in your friend group, I'm sure. Let's talk about this great show on YouTube, Tasting History with Max Miller. You have had as many as 4 million, 14 million. When I say 14, I want people to get, it's not 4 million, 14 million views, 14 million.
Oh, wow. Sounds like a lot.
I know. I keep saying, I was like, 14 million. I mean, that's an incredible number. I mean, if you just look at, how many people are watching different TV shows during the day, for instance, or like 14 million, you've got a lot of eyes on you. Let's talk about what you do on this show, because I was watching some episodes where you did a month about the Titanic. And when I say you did a month about the Titanic, friends, Max looks at the menus of what the passengers in different classes of travel on the Titanic were eating. And I learned that the first course that a third class passenger had on the Titanic was rice soup. And that made me sad because I feel like, like if that's going to be the beginning of your last meal, like it doesn't, I mean, that sounds so sad. Was there more to this? Were there some culinary surprises that you learned about people who were traveling on the Titanic? Because you spent a lot of time on these Titanic menus. Did anything surprise you?
I think, I mean, the most surprising is actually one of the big surprises is how well the third class got to eat. Yes, it's rice soup, but that's only one of several courses. And not long before Titanic, if you go, 20 years before, people in third class had to bring their own food. So, you'd be on a transatlantic crossing with no food unless you had brought it. So the fact that they were even fed was a big step up. And the diversity of dishes that they were getting was a lot more than what they would have had on land. Absolutely. Most people, it was bread and beer was the that was a lot of their meals. What's really though awe-inspiring is what the first class is eating, because today I feel like I have more in common with a third class passenger than I do with a first class passenger, because the first class passengers on Titanic, we think, like a first class passenger on an airplane. No, more like the first class passenger on Jeff Bezos's rocket, because these people were the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks of 1912 in England and the US. Some of the wealthiest people in the world were on that ship. And so the food that they were eating was just outrageous. 10 courses for dinner, and each course was more elaborate than the last. And then they would go have, cigars afterward. And it was just, it's fantastic. And the dishes, sometimes it's something that we can absolutely recognize today. Like I just made one that is a steak with béarnaise sauce and potatoes. Very wonderful, and something that you could find today at a nice restaurant. But then the dessert that I'm going to be doing is peaches in Chartreuse jelly. Well, you're not going to find that anywhere. It's basically gelatin or jello that has been made with Chartreuse, which is a liquor, and then with peaches inside. And so that's just so different from anything that we eat today.
Boozy peach jello. It's boozy, boozy peach jello. I want to try it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's those weirder dishes that I like and that I like exploring on the show in general, because it's just so different from anything that we eat today.
I think it's funny when you talk about the third class passengers on the Titanic having to bring their own food, because that is how, I don't know if we've gone backward, but isn't that like what it's like traveling today for most people who get on the plane? You have to beg for water.
I'm always having, I'm buying my sandwich in the airport for $19 or whatever, and bringing it on, because I know that, pretzels is all I'm going to be getting on a 6-hour flight.
Max, what have you learned about kind of different moments in American history from the food? I mean, that's sort of a sloppy way of asking the question. But when you go back to these Titanic meals, for instance, and you talk about the first class passengers, and you talk about this on your show, Tasting History, a lot of little courses. They might have 15 courses, but it would be, just a taste of a lot of different things. And then, you read or hear about these Gilded Age parties that would start at 9, and then they have a first course, then they're eating a supper at midnight, then they have breakfast in the morning. It strikes me that in moments in history where the gulf between the haves and the have-nots was even wider than it is now, the haves lived it up, like in ways that are just, staggering, that make Jeff Bezos's indulgences look conservative. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And all through history, not just American history, all through history, That is the status quo. The rich are mega, mega rich, and then pretty much everyone else is dirt poor. And there are very few people in the middle, going all the way back to ancient Rome and the Middle Ages and, throughout the 18th and 19th century. That's kind of been how it is. And what is disheartening for me as someone who's trying to learn about food history is there isn't much written about what 95% of the population was eating. We only have recipes, for the most part, from those very, very wealthy people, and everyone else just kind of gets forgotten. And I think that the last 70 years or 80 years here in the world in general, but here in the US especially, have been an anomaly. And that we'll look back and say, boy, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were very, very different than any time before and any time after. I do like to think that the world is getting better in general in so many ways, but when it comes to, that kind of that split of wealth, I do think that we're maybe going in the wrong direction at the moment.
I think that, as you and I sit here, you married, you in a marriage that would not have been legal in just a few years ago, and me having received an education and done things that people who look like me used to be killed for. The world's gotten better, but there's still a lot of work to do. What's something
there
that
always
you
will be?
Always will be. That's our job, Max. Our job is to keep it moving. We can have some fun though while we're keeping it moving. What is something that surprised you about the cuisines? Because I know you like you describe yourself as an Anglophile. I saw a delicious recipe for corned beef, medieval corned beef on your site. What's something that you learned about kind of the cuisine and dietary habits of if not the totally have-nots, at least the middle classes? We know how the super wealthy may have eaten, but what's something that you learned about the dietary habits of ordinary folks?
Obviously, it changes throughout history, but for the bulk of the last 1,000 years, those people at the bottom, it's funny because they have eaten, or they ate, the way that we want to eat now. More fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains. White bread, extremely refined white bread, was the expensive bread because it takes more time to make refined white flour. And so Wonder Bread style bread in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, that's what the rich people ate, whereas the poor people ate, this whole grain rye and wheat breads and everything. And they were the only people eating fresh fruits and, well, especially fresh vegetables. The wealthy always cooked their vegetables to the nth degree because fresh vegetables were seen as, one, poor people's food, but two, as actually a health issue. You had to boil it or roast it completely. So while the poor people's diets tended to not be as varied because they had very small amounts of meat in their diet for the most part, and when it was usually salted meat or cured. They had been sitting there for months. It was actually usually typically rather healthy, which I think is one of the reasons why we tend to think of them dying so much younger back then than we do now. But when you take out infant mortality and dying as a child, they didn't live that much shorter of lives than we did, and they probably had healthier lives, at least in their diet, when they could get the food. The problem always in history is famine is just so common, and that's not really something that we deal with now here in the United States. Obviously, there are people who are hungry, but famine is not something that we have. Large swaths of the population unable to get a hold of food. So that is something that is also very, very new. Until very recently, famine was a big problem, and that's usually what took people out culinarily, at least.
Well, if you think about it, once upon a time, when the people who were in charge of the food were women who generally weren't allowed to do much else. And all of a sudden, they've got a choice between, hey, I can grind the bread by hand and then let it rise and then go to the oven and then let it rise and then do all of that. Or I can go get some Wonder Bread and then have some coffee with my girlfriends. Like option two is a much more attractive option if you were the one doing the work. But you've got an interesting vantage point about history and food and culture. Do you think that we are now en route to sort of a new consciousness toward food? Are we entering a different type of historical moment for food? If you know what I mean, like does food mean more to us now than maybe it did in like the growth of the fast food culture in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s?
I would like to think so, but then I also wonder if that doesn't come from a little bit of privilege where I live, where we live in general in the US. Sometimes it's kind of hard to think of the entire world. I don't think that that's I think that our changing views of food are not shared by much of the rest of the world right now. And it's simply because we get food so inexpensively here and we have that kind of luxury. We think of food as expensive. It's not expensive in comparison with much of the world. So I think that's a bit of a luxury that we have, which, I'm happy to take. I do think that there is a growing, just the idea of health is around food is a growing topic. But it's always been there. Going back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, in every cookbook, you find recipes for what they called invalids or convalescents, people who were sick or, needed food for their health. Granted, most of their ideas were terrible. It was just like weak broth is good for if you're sick, and have this type of fat if you have gout or whatever. But that idea of food is health, it's not new. It's just, I think we're getting better at it. I would like to think. That said, I still eat fast food. So in a lot of ways, we're not getting any better because it's cheaper.
And there are different fast food options. So we shouldn't paint with too broad a brush.
Yeah. I am curious looking ahead, and I don't think that this will be in the next 10 years or even 100 years, but I do think in the future, one huge change that we'll have culinarily is we're just going to eat a lot less meat. I think that kind of animal rights is going to end up becoming a huge issue in the future, and that will affect how we eat. And I say that not as a vegetarian. I eat a lot of meat and I love meat. So knowing though that in the future, I do think that that's going to actually be the really big change in how we eat and it's not just an animal rights thing. It's more of animals take up a lot of space and are very expensive to raise. And that's not a really sustainable thing, at least in the quantity that we're eating them.
Question for you, Max. Your fairy god person says to you, you get to be a guest at a dinner party at any moment in history. Do you want to be what is the best historical moment in your view for food?
For food?
Is it a Gilded Age dinner? Is it a 1960s dinner? What is the best?
Definitely not the 60s.
Is it a 17th century dinner in a palace somewhere in Scotland? You can pick a century and you can pick your place. Where do you get to be a dinner guest? Where do you want to be a dinner guest? And when? When and where?
I think I would have to choose Versailles during the reign of the Sun King. So like the 1670s, 1680s, at least if you're the king. Or the royal family, because they had this meal that the king would sit there and he would have sometimes up to hundreds of dishes brought before him and set in front of him, and he would look at it and maybe taste it and then move it away, and then the next one would come. And each one would be more fantastical than the last. And it was a huge change in the way that we ate. It was around this time that the idea of sweet is for dessert, that was a new thing. Sugar went in dessert, not in entrees and appetizers. Drinking different wines with different foods and having fresh vegetables, having vegetables at all, that everything was all new, and everything wasn't so highly spiced. It was starting to be more flavored by higher quality ingredients and lots of herbs and everything. And I would love to have been present for one of those, again, if I'm the king, because after the food passed the king, it went back to the kitchen, sat for hours and hours. All of his courtiers were watching him do this. And only when he was finished could the courtiers purchase some of the food that had passed by the king. And by then it was cold.
His leftovers.
Yes.
So that makes me know that it only made sense to be alive in the past if you were royalty.
Let me tell you. That's why I always want to visit the past, but for like 5 minutes, and only then if I'm rich.
Yeah.
Indoor
you know what,
plumbing
Max? I never want to visit the past. I never want to visit the past. I'm going to stay. I am staying right here.
We definitely live in the best time.
We live in the best time. And I think that when Max is king, I want to go to dinner at his palace. In the meantime, check out Max's YouTube channel, Tasting History with Max Miller. It's not just about what they were eating on the Titanic. It's not just about this delicious corned beef. It's not just about the rice soup. You will learn so much about food and history and where we all come from. And frankly, going back, Max, to where we started, you are such an inspiration because something dark happened to you, and you took that darkness and you turned it in. You didn't just make lemonade. You made lemonade with a shot of vodka if you drink and some mint and berries. So good on you. Good on you, brother, for doing that. I hope you come back. And everybody, check out Max's YouTube channel, Tasting History with Max Miller. Thanks, Max. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.